The scream came just before midnight. It wasn't the kind born from pain. It was something worse. The kind that makes even palace guards freeze, pressing their backs against the cold stone walls, praying it will stop. It didn't. It echoed through the women's quarters of Galastan Palace, twisting down marble corridors, through silk curtains, through silence that had learned to pretend it couldn't hear. Everyone inside knew exactly what it meant. Another one was breaking. Her name was Zara, 16 years old, a Persian princess born into a dynasty that traded daughters like currency. By dawn, she would be the wife of a man who had bought her with 3 provinces. By morning, she would be gone, not dead, but hollowed out so completely that she might as well have been. This is not a story about love or royalty. It's a story about control, about how an empire learned to erase human will without ever drawing blood. For centuries, the royal courts of Persia perfected a system of obedience so total it could turn any girl into a living ghost. Tonight, we're stepping behind the palace walls, past the silks, the jewels, the portraits of smiling brides, into the ritual no historian was meant to describe. You'll see how the Qajar Empire built one of the most sophisticated systems of psychological torture in history. And by the end, you may realize something far more disturbing. Those same techniques didn't die with the empire. They just changed their names. The Persian Empire of the 19th century glittered on the surface. Mosaics, gardens, mirrored halls where courtiers bowed beneath chandeliers. But behind the architecture of power was a currency far older than gold: daughters. Every alliance, every fragile peace, every expansion of territory came sealed not with signatures, but with marriages. A girl's body could be worth an army. Her smile could pay a debt. Her silence could purchase loyalty. By 1847, the Qajar dynasty had ruled Persia for more than 60 years. Their empire stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf, deserts to the north, mountains to the west, and cities that glowed with the wealth of trade. The Shah ruled from Tehran with a mixture of divine authority and political cunning. His court was a labyrinth of loyalty, bribery, and spectacle, where every gesture was calculated and every relationship transactional. To outsiders, European envoys, missionaries, and merchants, the Qajars looked like an exotic monarchy wrapped in tradition. They wrote about opulent banquets, music echoing through rose gardens, and the mesmerizing beauty of the Shah's daughters. What they never saw, what they were never allowed to see, was the machinery that kept those smiles fixed, the fear hidden beneath embroidered silk. A royal daughter was not born free. From the moment she took her first breath, her destiny was already logged in ledgers, her future debated in council rooms she would never enter. The word princess in that world did not mean luxury, it meant obligation. Her lineage was a tool. Her education, music, calligraphy, poetry, was never for her pleasure but for her value as a symbol of refinement to be exchanged. When the empire needed a general's loyalty, the solution was simple: a wedding. If the provinces rebelled, a marriage could buy peace. When a neighboring governor hesitated to send tribute, he could be bound to the throne through a daughter's dowry. A girl's hand was a political instrument wielded by men who might never speak her name again once the deal was sealed. To understand Zara's world, you have to picture the palace not as a home, but as a marketplace of alliances. Ministers whispered in hallways about which daughter might strengthen which alliance. Mothers prayed not for their children's happiness, but for survivable matches, a husband old enough to die soon, perhaps, or distant enough not to interfere. Every rumor mattered, every expression carried weight. And for a 16-year-old girl raised in those corridors, fear was as ordinary as the morning call to prayer. When a decision was made about her marriage, it was not announced to her directly. It filtered down like rumor, disguised as gossip among servants. The Shah is pleased. The general has offered provinces. They say his family owns half the north. By the time the truth reached Zara, it was already carved into fate. Her engagement had been discussed, debated, and finalized before she had been told a word. Her future husband, Mirza Hassan Khan, was 43, twice widowed, a commander known for his discipline and for the estates he ruled. His first wife had died in childbirth. His second had succumbed to melancholy, as the records put it, a phrase that could mean anything from grief to suicide. None of it mattered. What mattered was his loyalty and his usefulness. The marriage would bind him to the royal bloodline, and in return he would pledge troops, land, and obedience. In a council chamber lined with maps and ledgers, men spoke her name as though it were an entry on a balance sheet. Her blood is pure, one said. Her dowry will legitimize the northern territories. Another countered, but she's still young. The Shah's advisor shrugged. They grow into it. They always do. And with that, a girl's childhood was traded for political security. The strange cruelty of this world was that it never recognized itself as cruel. To the courtiers, this was order, the way things had always been. They believed they were preserving harmony, that by sacrificing the autonomy of a few young women, they guaranteed the stability of millions. Tradition gave them the language to hide their own violence. Zara's mother, Asha, understood it better than anyone. She had been a bride at 15, chosen for her beauty and her family's influence, and had learned to smile through the ache of obedience. When she was told of her daughter's engagement, she didn't cry. She merely nodded and said the line women of her rank had repeated for centuries. May she serve well. That was the measure of virtue, not love, not joy, not even survival. Service. In the weeks following the announcement, Zara began to notice changes. The palace corridors that once felt endless grew narrower. Guards appeared where there had been none. Her tutors spoke less about poetry and more about posture. The laughter of other girls quieted when she entered the room. She had become sacred property, valuable, untouchable, and completely controlled. Her clothing changed first. The soft cotton dresses she wore in the gardens were replaced by layers of heavy brocade. Her shoes, once practical, now pinched her feet into the shape expected of nobility. Even her jewelry had a purpose, each piece chosen to display her father's generosity rather than her own taste. She began to understand that her body was a kind of performance, rehearsed daily for an audience she hadn't met. Then came the restrictions. She was no longer allowed to visit the library alone, though she had always loved reading. Male servants were dismissed from her quarters. Her world filled instead with older women whose faces carried the calm of those who had survived their own breaking. When she asked why, she was told, "It is time to prepare." The words sounded gentle, but their meaning was a sentence. Preparation, in that context, didn't mean education or celebration. It meant transformation. The empire had perfected a process to turn girls into instruments of compliance. And the first step was isolation. By removing her from the life she'd known, the freedom of the gardens, the companionship of her cousins, the sound of her own laughter, they began to reshape her sense of self. The palace that had once been her playground became a labyrinth of rules. Every door now required permission. Every word was monitored. Every moment of solitude was a reminder that she no longer belonged to herself. Even the architecture reinforced it. The women's quarters were designed to control movement. High walls, mirrored halls that reflected without revealing, corridors that curved to conceal who might be listening. The sound of footsteps echoed endlessly, a constant reminder of surveillance. Privacy was a myth. At night, Zara would stand by the latticed window, looking toward the distant hills beyond Tehran, where she imagined villages alive with laughter and unguarded conversation. She had never been there, but the thought of people living without being watched felt revolutionary. She didn't yet understand that this longing, this fragile desire for selfhood, was exactly what the system intended to erase. For the Qajar court, obedience wasn't just expected, it was engineered. Power, they knew, was fragile when built only on fear. But if you could teach a person to believe their submission was natural, to feel that resistance was shameful, then control became eternal. That was the brilliance and the horror of the Qajar method. It didn't rely on chains or prisons. It relied on ritual, etiquette, and repetition. 1,000 small lessons whispered into a girl's mind until she no longer knew where her own thoughts ended and the empire's began. By the end of that spring, Zara's transformation was underway. The world outside her chamber continued. Armies marched, treaties were signed. The Shah entertained foreign diplomats. But inside those mirrored walls, a single process had begun, the careful erasure of a human being. And somewhere beyond those walls, as the city slept beneath the scent of jasmine and smoke, the first rumor spread among the servants. Quiet, almost tender. Another wedding is coming. No one mentioned her name. They didn't have to. Everyone knew what that meant. Spring sunlight spilled across the marble courtyards of Galastan Palace when Zara's name was quietly signed away. She didn't hear the words that sealed it. She wasn't in the chamber where her future was debated, but the air around her seemed to change that afternoon. A servant's tone softened into pity, her governess avoided eye contact, and one of her cousins whispered, "She's the one." She was 14, still more child than woman, still laughing too loudly in corridors, still sneaking books of poetry from the library when she thought no one was watching. But that day, her laughter died in her throat. The silence that followed was not ordinary silence. It was the kind that settles over a place when everyone knows something terrible, but no one dares say it aloud. The marriage was decided in a council chamber lined with polished wood and Persian carpets. Men discussed her life as if they were trading land, measuring the worth of her lineage in acres and soldiers. Mirza Hassan Khan, her future husband, was not present either. His emissary was. The two families signed the contract that would unite their bloodlines, a gesture that was supposed to guarantee loyalty to the throne. In truth, it guaranteed only Zara's disappearance into another man's household. When the official decree reached the women's quarters, Zara's mother Asha received it with perfect composure. She kissed the document, pressed it to her forehead, and whispered a prayer that her daughter would serve well. To serve well, that was the phrase women in the palace used instead of to live well. It meant obedience, endurance, silence. That evening, Zara sat beside her mother as incense burned between them. Asha didn't speak at first. She poured tea, watched the steam rise, and finally said, "You must begin to behave as a wife, not a daughter." Her voice was kind, but final, the tone of someone repeating what had once been said to her. Zara wanted to ask what that meant, but the words tangled in her throat. Something inside her already knew she wouldn't like the answer. The next morning, the transformation began. Her chambers, once filled with books, trinkets, and the hum of other girls gossiping, were rearranged overnight. The books disappeared. The cushions were replaced by heavier brocade furniture. Two attendants she'd grown up with were reassigned to another wing. In their place came older women, silent, watchful, efficient. They called her Khanum, the formal title for a noblewoman, though their tone carried no warmth. At first, the changes seemed subtle. The guards outside her doors doubled. Meals were taken at fixed times. She was told where she could walk, when she could pray, when she could bathe. The palace gardens she loved, with fountains whispering between orange trees, were suddenly off limits and less escorted. "It is not proper," one of the women said. Zara nodded, though she didn't know why it had stopped being proper overnight. What unsettled her most was the way people stopped speaking freely in her presence. Her tutors now measured every word. Jokes ended abruptly when she entered a room. Even the servants who once told her stories now bowed their heads and spoke only to confirm orders. It was as if she had become sacred and contaminated at the same time, untouchable, not because of reverence, but because of purpose. Late one afternoon, she followed the sound of laughter to the courtyard where other girls, cousins, and distant relatives were playing a simple game with pebbles. She called out to them, but the laughter stopped. One girl smiled apologetically and said, "We are not allowed to tire you, princess." Zara froze. Tire me? She wasn't ill. She wasn't fragile. But the phrase followed her for days. Every time she reached out for normalcy, someone reminded her that she was being preserved. It was only weeks later that she overheard the word that changed everything: preparation. The overseer of brides, a severe woman named Miriam, was discussing it with another attendant outside Zara's chamber. "She will begin the preparation next month," Miriam said. "Her schedule must be adjusted." Preparation, the word sounded innocent, even ceremonial. Zara thought of embroidery lessons or the customs of the wedding. But when she asked one of the attendants about it, the woman's eyes flickered with something that looked like fear. "Do not ask," she said softly. "It is better if you don't know yet." From that day, Zara began to feel time collapsing around her. Her mornings became ritualized. She woke to the chime of a bronze bell, bathed in water infused with rose petals, then was dressed in layers of silk that took 2 servants to fasten. Every gesture was supervised. How she held her cup, how she stepped onto a carpet, how she looked at her reflection. Mistakes were corrected immediately. Again, Miriam would say, until Zara's movements felt like someone else's choreography. The palace that had once felt like home became a maze of invisible boundaries. Certain corridors were now forbidden. Certain faces vanished. The eunuch who used to escort her to the gardens stopped coming. In his place was another, older, quieter, his presence constant, his eyes unreadable. Zara began to realize that nothing she did was unobserved. At night, she lay awake and tried to remember what freedom had felt like. The memory of laughter already felt distant, like a sound heard underwater. She started writing poems on scraps of paper, hiding them behind the wooden panels of her bed. One line returned again and again. Even the walls are watching. Meanwhile, preparations for the engagement celebration unfolded outside her world. The palace buzzed with tailors, goldsmiths, and servants carrying bolts of fabric. None of it reached her directly. She saw glimpses through the carved screens, flashes of crimson silk, trays of jewels, men signing documents. Her name echoed in corridors, but she wasn't invited into the conversations that shaped her life. Then, one morning, she was summoned to the mirror hall, a vast chamber whose walls were covered in thousands of tiny mirrors that caught and multiplied every reflection. Standing at its center, Zara saw herself not once, but 100 times. Her face fractured into fragments, each one slightly distorted. Around her stood the women of the court, her mother among them, the overseer Miriam at her shoulder. "This," Miriam said, "is where you will learn to carry yourself." For hours, Zara was made to practice walking across the marble floor, her gaze lowered, her hands clasped, every step measured to the rhythm of a drum. If she looked up too soon, Miriam snapped her fan. "A bride does not meet the eyes of men," she said. Her humility must speak louder than her words. By sunset, Zara's neck ached. Her knees trembled, but the lesson was clear. The body was the message. Grace was obedience. Silence was virtue. When she returned to her chamber, she found her books removed again, even the hidden ones. In their place sat a single object, a small bronze mirror, polished to perfection. A note beside it read, "You will watch yourself until you forget to see." The message wasn't signed. It didn't have to be. That night, she looked into the mirror and didn't recognize the girl staring back. Her face was the same, but her eyes had begun to change, the spark of defiance dimming, replaced by something quieter, something taut. She wondered if her mother had once looked the same way. Outside, the city of Tehran was alive. Merchants shouting, carriages clattering through narrow streets, the smell of spices drifting on the wind. But none of it reached her. She was sealed inside history, her fate as fixed as the stars painted on the ceiling above her bed. The following week, the overseer announced that Zara's formal conditioning would begin. The phrase made the other attendants stiffen, as if it carried a weight no one wanted to name. Zara didn't ask what it meant. She was beginning to understand that questions were a luxury she no longer possessed. From that moment, the palace stopped being her world and became her prison, elegant, silent, and inescapable. The first lesson came at dawn. Zara was woken not by the call to prayer or the rustle of servants, but by silence. Heavy, deliberate silence that filled the chamber like a command. The overseer of brides, Miriam, stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 attendants holding scrolls and a small silver bell. When the bell rang, the room changed. Everything that followed would now exist within its rhythm. "This," Miriam said, her voice calm as polished marble, "is the beginning of your instruction." The word instruction sounded harmless, even polite, but the next 6 months would strip that word of any innocence. From the first day, Zara learned that speech was dangerous, not for what it revealed, but for the illusion of choice it carried. In her lessons, she was told that words were tools of arrogance, that true grace was found in silence. "A virtuous bride," Miriam said, pacing slowly around her, "does not think out loud. She waits to be asked. She answers only what is required. Anything more invites judgment." The rules were written in neat Persian script on a parchment hung beside her mirror. Speak only when addressed. Respond in approved forms. Never express preference. Never contradict. Gratitude is the only acceptable emotion. There were 43 permitted phrases in total, 43 small cages built from syllables. "As you wish. Forgive my inadequacy. Thank you for your kindness. With permission, may I?" Each phrase sounded elegant, even noble, but their repetition slowly hollowed her out. At first, Zara tried to play along, believing it to be etiquette training. She would smile faintly when Miriam corrected her posture or rephrased her responses. But after the fifth day, she noticed how the women around her spoke the same way. Their sentences clipped, rhythmically identical, like echoes of a single voice. When she accidentally said something outside the permitted forms, "I don't understand," Miriam didn't raise her voice. She simply struck the bell once and said, "You have spoken beyond yourself." That day, Zara ate alone. No one explained why. Isolation became the first punishment. Whenever she disobeyed, she was confined to her chamber for an entire day, forbidden to speak or be spoken to. Meals were left on the floor by the door. The attendants entered only to collect empty dishes. Even the eunuch who guarded her door avoided her gaze. The silence wasn't absence, it was weaponized. It taught her that sound itself could hurt. After 2 weeks, Zara began censoring her thoughts before they even formed. The rules weren't just about speech anymore, they were shaping her mind. She stopped describing things in her head, stopped narrating her feelings to herself. Words like want, wish, and why started to feel forbidden even in thought. The women who trained her, though calm and gentle in tone, understood exactly what they were doing. They were engineers dismantling a personality. One of them, an older woman named Soraya, once told her, "The tongue is a dangerous creature, princess. It gives birth to rebellion." Zara nodded, though she wanted to ask, rebellion against what? But she didn't. She already knew the answer. Rebellion against the life chosen for her. In the women's quarters, there were other girls, 6 of them, each at a different stage of preparation. They shared lessons, meals, and punishment. At first, Zara thought their company might be comforting. She tried to whisper once, after dark, when the attendants had left. "Do you miss your home?" she asked the girl beside her, a quiet figure named Seema. Seema's face froze. She didn't respond. The next morning, both were summoned. Miriam's voice was soft, almost regretful. "Speech spreads infection," she said. "Compassion weakens discipline." For the rest of the day, Zara and Seema sat at opposite corners of the hall, forbidden to look at each other. By evening, Seema's eyes were red. The message was clear, connection was danger. Over time, the girls began to monitor each other, reporting any deviation, not out of malice but survival. If one broke a rule, all were punished. The system made them complicit in their own control. When one girl stammered during a recitation, the rest were made to kneel for an hour in silence. The following day, they avoided her completely, terrified of guilt by association. Zara began to understand how isolation worked. It didn't start by taking people away from you. It started by making you afraid of them. By the second month, her vocabulary had shrunk so much that entire days passed without a full sentence. When she woke, she greeted her attendants with a murmured, "As you wish." When she was handed tea, she said, "Thank you for your kindness." When Miriam corrected her, she whispered, "Forgive my inadequacy." The words fit perfectly, like clothes tailored to someone else's body. And yet, sometimes, when she was alone, she mouthed forbidden words under her breath, just to feel their shape again. Why? Please, stop. Words no one else would hear. But the system was clever. It didn't just forbid. It replaced. Miriam and her assistants constantly praised her compliance, calling her graceful, wise, calm. The more Zara disappeared, the more they rewarded her. Every fragment of identity she surrendered was met with approval. The process made obedience feel like achievement. Once, during a lesson on bridal propriety, Miriam told a story about a princess from an earlier generation who had refused to learn. She thought her voice mattered. Miriam said, sipping tea. She believed her husband would love her for her mind. It destroyed her. He found her disobedient, uncontrollable. In the end, she brought shame to her family. Zara felt her chest tighten. She wanted to ask what had happened to that woman. But again, silence. Questions were traps. At night, she dreamed of her own voice echoing through corridors, trying to find its way back to her. Sometimes she woke up gasping, unsure whether she had spoken aloud. The attendants would appear immediately, whispering, "It's all right, princess. You were dreaming." But it wasn't all right. It was working. By the third month, Zara could no longer recall what her laughter sounded like. When she tried to remember, the memory came muffled, as if wrapped in cloth. Her reflection in the bronze mirror no longer startled her. It was simply another person she obeyed. Then came the final linguistic test, a ritual they called the Day of Silence. For 24 hours, none of the girls were allowed to speak a single word. They were instructed to communicate only through gesture, lowering their eyes, bowing, or placing a hand over the heart. Each movement carried meaning. Each mistake brought punishment. The exercise was supposed to teach speech through humility, but its true purpose was far darker. It replaced the freedom of expression with ritualized submission. When the test ended, Zara felt lightheaded, almost euphoric. She hadn't spoken in a full day, and yet she felt as if she had accomplished something. That was the genius of the process. It taught her to confuse silence with strength. That night, Miriam entered her chamber and smiled. "You are becoming what you were born to be," she said. Zara wanted to believe it wasn't true, but as she opened her mouth to respond, the only words that came out were, "As you wish." And for the first time, she realized she hadn't even thought before saying it. It no longer felt like obedience. It felt like instinct. The transformation of Zara's voice was only the beginning. Once silence had taken hold, the next step was to train her body, to make it fluent in submission. The women of the palace called it movement instruction, but it was not dance. It was not grace. It was discipline disguised as elegance, obedience performed through muscle and bone. Every morning at dawn, long before the first call to prayer, the hall of mirrors filled with the sound of bare feet sliding over marble. 7 girls stood in a line, dressed in identical pale linen gowns that hung loose enough to conceal shape, but tight enough to restrict movement. The air was cold. Incense burned in the corners to mask the scent of exhaustion. At the far end of the hall stood Zainab, the mistress of ritual, tall, severe, and wrapped in black silk. Her face was pale and unreadable, her voice slow and rhythmically precise, like the ticking of a metronome. When she spoke, even the servants held their breath. "Every body tells a story," she began, "and your story must be silence." The lesson that day, and every day that followed, was built on a single principle. The body must forget how to move freely. The girls were introduced to what Zainab called the 8 movements of obedience. Each one represented a state of subordination: the greeting bow, the serving bow, the retreat bow, the posture of stillness, the kneeling of gratitude, the hands of apology, the turning of dismissal, and the lowering of the gaze. Each movement had rules so exacting that even a degree of error was considered failure. The head must lower 30 degrees when greeting authority, Zainab instructed, tapping a wooden rod against the marble to mark the rhythm. No more, no less. 35 suggests weakness. 25 suggests pride. Either one invites disaster. Zara tried to follow. At first, the precision fascinated her, like geometry brought to life. But after hours of repetition, fascination gave way to pain. Her spine ached. Her knees burned. Her feet blistered. Still, when her posture wavered, Zainab's voice sliced through the air. Again, the women who watched, the overseers, the attendants, the elder tutors, seemed to measure not progress but endurance. They corrected every flaw with cold efficiency. A hand twisted downward, a back pressed lower, a gaze forcibly redirected toward the floor. "You are not a statue," Zainab said one day, circling Zara like a hawk. "You are a vessel. Empty yourself." The command was not metaphorical. Zara learned that to survive the lessons, she had to detach from her own body. She stopped thinking of the pain as hers. The ache in her shoulders belonged to the palace, the bruises on her knees to the dynasty. The less she claimed, the easier it became. By the end of the first week, Zara's movements were smaller, slower, quieter. Her steps shortened to the length of her own foot. Her hands never rose above her chest. She no longer looked ahead when walking, only downward, as if the floor itself demanded reverence. It was during the second week that humiliation entered the lessons. When a girl made a mistake, she was not scolded privately. She was corrected before everyone. The others were summoned to watch as Zainab demonstrated the proper way by manipulating the girl's limbs, tilting her chin down, forcing her knees to bend deeper, adjusting her shoulders until the pose conveyed total compliance. "Observe," Zainab would say, "how resistance leaves the body once pain becomes instruction." Zara witnessed this often, but the first time it happened to her, she felt something in her chest fracture. Her mistake was simple. She had lifted her head too soon after a bow. Zainab stopped the lesson mid-movement. Too proud, she said. The rod tapped the floor once. Everyone watch. Zara froze as Zainab stepped behind her and pressed a hand against the back of her neck, forcing her head down. This, Zainab said, is what happens when a bride forgets her place. She pushed harder. And this is what humility feels like. The room was silent except for Zara's shallow breathing. When she was released, she stayed bowed longer than necessary, partly out of fear, partly because she couldn't bring herself to straighten fully. That night, she could still feel the imprint of Zainab's fingers at the base of her neck. Over the following weeks, the lessons grew longer. The line between instruction and punishment blurred. Sometimes, Zainab would call a girl forward and command her to perform all 8 movements without rest. If she faltered, she started over. The repetition induced something close to hypnosis. Hours could pass without awareness. By the end, the girls moved not with thought, but reflex, their bodies answering commands before their minds registered them. Zara began to understand the purpose. This was not about posture or beauty. It was conditioning. Each gesture was a rewiring of her nervous system, teaching her to surrender before she even realized she was doing so. The body, once broken into obedience, no longer needed the whip. The most insidious part was the praise. Whenever a girl performed flawlessly, the instructors applauded softly. Graceful, they said. Perfect. The words were like rewards, but their effect was poisonous. Zara found herself striving for them, aching for approval even as she despised what it required. The applause became proof of survival. And survival, in the palace, was the only form of victory left to her. By the 3rd month, Zara's body moved with an unnatural stillness. She glided instead of walked, bowed without hesitation, never lifted her eyes above anyone older than her. The transformation was so complete that even her breathing seemed rehearsed, shallow, measured, almost silent. But there were moments, fleeting and dangerous, when the old Zara flickered through. One morning, as she practiced the kneeling of gratitude, she caught her reflection in a mirror. Pale face, lowered head, shoulders curved in submission, and for an instant, she felt rage. It came like a jolt, raw and electric, and before she could stop herself, she straightened fully, lifting her chin. The room fell silent. Zainab turned slowly, her expression unreadable. Again, she said. Zara hesitated. Again. Her voice was soft, but it carried steel. Zara knelt, bowed, corrected herself. The lesson resumed as if nothing had happened. But later that night, when everyone had gone, she returned to the hall. The candles had burned low, the air heavy with incense. She stood before the mirror, staring at the girl who looked back, the one she no longer recognized. Without thinking, she raised her hand. For a second, she wanted to shatter the reflection. But her arm froze halfway, her muscles refusing to obey. The training was too deep. Even alone, she could not move against command. That was when she realized the truth. Her body had learned to betray her. Over time, this awareness faded too. The constant correction, the repetition, the endless cycle of praise and punishment, all of it blurred into a single emotion, exhaustion. And exhaustion was what the system wanted. A tired body doesn't fight. It obeys. Months later, when she finally walked into her husband's chambers for the first time, she would not need to be told how to bow, how to kneel, how to hide her fear. Her body would remember. It would perform perfectly. It would do exactly what the empire had trained it to do, surrender. But on that spring morning, as the sun rose over Tehran and the palace bells rang to signal another day of lessons, Zara stood in the training hall with 6 other girls, their movements synchronized, their shadows blending together. And as Zainab's voice echoed, lower, smaller, quieter, their bodies obeyed in perfect silence. There came a day when silence and obedience were no longer enough. The overseers wanted proof, not of Zara's progress, but of her surrender. They called it the testing. To the palace officials, it was described as a psychological refinement ritual, part of preparing royal brides for their responsibilities. In truth, it was the moment designed to break them completely. Zara first heard the word whispered by an attendant while she was being dressed one morning. The woman's hands trembled slightly as she tied the sash around Zara's waist. "They say the mistress begins testing today," she murmured, eyes fixed on the floor. Then, quickly, as if regretting it, she added, May you answer well. Answer well. The phrase sounded harmless, but Zara had learned that in the palace, ordinary words hid extraordinary violence. When she entered the hall that day, the air was heavier than usual. The mirrors were covered with dark silks. Candles replaced the morning light. The usual scent of roses had been replaced by something sharper, a mixture of smoke and jasmine that clung to the throat. At the center stood Zanab, the mistress of ritual, her black robe gleaming faintly like oil. The instruction is complete, Zanab said. Now we see what remains. She circled Zara slowly, her bare footsteps echoing in the silence. You have learned the movements, she continued. You have learned to hold your tongue. But obedience is not knowledge. It is fear made perfect. Today, we make sure your fear does not fail you. Zara felt her stomach twist, but she did not move. The other girls watched from the edge of the room, their faces expressionless. They had all been through their own versions of this ritual. No one spoke of what had happened during theirs. The testing began with something deceptively simple, a greeting. Zanab took a seat on a low chair and gestured for Zara to approach. Enter as a wife would enter her husband's chamber, she commanded. Zara bowed deeply, lowered her gaze, took small steps forward, and stopped at the precise distance she had been taught, 3 paces away. Zanab's voice was sharp. Too fast. Zara repeated the movement. Too slow. Again. Too proud. Each time she corrected herself, the mistress found another fault. Your shoulders betray arrogance. Your eyes linger too long. Your steps suggest uncertainty. Start again. By the 10th repetition, Zara's movements had lost all grace. She was trembling, her breath shallow, her vision flickering. That was the point. The goal wasn't perfection. It was confusion. When she faltered again, Zanab's tone changed. How disappointing, she said softly, almost kindly. Your husband will be ashamed. Tell me, do you want to shame him? No, mistress, Zara whispered. Then why do you move like a farmer's daughter? I will do better. You said that before. Zanab leaned forward. Perhaps you are not ready. Perhaps you are too fragile. What would happen, I wonder, if he sees your weakness? The words struck harder than any blow. Zara's mind raced. There was no correct answer, and she knew it. If she denied weakness, it would sound like pride. If she admitted it, it would confirm failure. Zanab's silence stretched until it became unbearable. Then, she turned away and said to the attendants, "She will learn through correction." That phrase, in the palace, was a sentence. From that day forward, the testing became constant, at meals, during rest, while walking through the corridors. At unpredictable moments, an instructor would appear and issue an impossible order. Pour tea without making a sound. Bow lower than before, but not too low. Smile as if pleased, but not happy. Each demand contradicted the last. Each success led to punishment disguised as improvement. The randomness was deliberate, a lesson in powerlessness. Once, during a meal, Zara reached for a cup of water without being told. A voice behind her snapped. "Did you ask permission?" She froze. "I thought not," the mistress said, lifting the cup herself and pouring the water onto the floor. "Thirst is good. It reminds you that nothing belongs to you." Zara whispered, "Forgive my inadequacy." Louder. She obeyed. Louder. By the 3rd repetition, her voice cracked. The mistress smiled faintly. Better. Weeks passed like this, commands without pattern, punishment without reason. The girls began to flinch at footsteps, to hesitate before every movement. They learned to exist in a state of constant readiness, hearts pounding even in sleep. The testing had succeeded in its truest goal, making fear permanent. The cruelest trial came unexpectedly, one evening during candlelight prayer. Zara and the others were kneeling in silence when Zanab entered and announced, "We begin the final assessment." An attendant stepped forward carrying a tray covered with silk. When she lifted the cloth, the girls saw a small bronze mirror, a folded piece of parchment, and a ring. Zanab's voice lowered. "In marriage, you will know anger. You will know cruelty. You will know pain. And still, you must not resist. These are the tools by which you will be tested again and again. Tonight, we prepare you for that truth." She picked up the mirror and held it before Zara's face. "Look at yourself. Tell me what you see." Zara hesitated. "I see your servant." "Wrong," Zanab said. "You see pride. You see the girl who still thinks she can suffer and survive unchanged. That girl must die." She set down the mirror and handed Zara the ring. This represents your promise. A wife does not break her promise, even when it breaks her. Zara's throat tightened. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. The mistress stepped closer, her voice now almost tender. Say it. Say what, mistress? Say. I will not resist. Zara hesitated. Say it. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Something in her chest rebelled, not with words, but with silence. The pause was dangerous. The other girls shifted uncomfortably, sensing the air turn electric. Zanab's eyes narrowed. You hesitate. Zara forced herself to speak, her voice shaking. I will not resist. Again. I will not resist. Louder. I will not resist. Good, Zanab said. Now you are ready. But Zara didn't feel ready. She felt hollow. The phrase echoed in her head long after the lesson ended, long after the candles were extinguished. She whispered it again and again in the dark, not because she believed it, but because she was terrified that if she stopped saying it, she would forget how to speak altogether. By the end of the testing month, Zara's transformation was nearly complete. She had stopped dreaming. Her heart no longer raced at commands, it anticipated them. Even her fear had become predictable, something she could manage, like breathing. And yet, sometimes, late at night, she felt a flicker of something else, not rebellion, but awareness. The quiet understanding that her mind was being rewritten. She would trace her fingers along the scars on her knees from endless kneeling and wonder how much of her belonged to her anymore. One night, she found herself whispering to her reflection, "Who are you waiting for?" But the reflection did not answer. The next morning, when the bell rang, she rose automatically, bowed, and spoke the words she'd been trained to say. As you wish. Her tone was flawless. Her posture, perfect. But deep inside, buried beneath the rehearsed gestures, something small and fragile refused to die. It wasn't hope exactly. Hope was too dangerous. It was memory. The faint memory of her own laughter, the sound of her name spoken by someone who loved her, the feel of sunlight before it was filtered through the lattice of control. And as the mistress declared the testing complete, as the other girls lowered their heads in synchronized submission, Zara blinked, just once, and let that memory flicker behind her eyes. It was invisible, unmeasurable, but it was still hers. By the 5th month, silence and fear had fused into a single state of being. Zara no longer distinguished between obedience and survival. Both were the same act performed by a hollow body. The overseers had stripped away her words, her gestures, even her sleep. Now, they came for what remained, her body itself. It began without warning. One morning, a eunuch appeared at her chamber door and said simply, "The physician awaits." No explanation, no permission to ask. 2 attendants led her down a long marble corridor she had never seen before, one that sloped downward, dimly lit by narrow windows that filtered in cold light. The air grew colder as they descended, and the familiar scent of rosewater gave way to something sterile and metallic. They entered a room she would never forget. The space was wide, lined with brass instruments and wooden cabinets. In the center stood a long table covered with white linen. Candles flickered in metal holders, their light reflected by polished steel tools arranged in precise rows. The smell was overwhelming: camphor, alcohol, oil. And at the far end of the room, dressed in gray robes, stood Dr. Mirza Bahram, the palace physician. He had the air of a man who had performed the same task countless times. His hair was silver, his expression neutral, his tone almost kind. "Come forward," he said. "We must ensure your suitability." Zara stepped toward the table. Her attendants removed her veil, then her robe. The chill of the air hit her skin like a slap. She wanted to cover herself, but didn't dare move. The doctor gestured for her to lie down. "This will not take long," he said, the same phrase one might use before pruning a rose. He began with measurements: height, arm span, hip width, chest circumference. His hands were cold, efficient. Each number was spoken aloud to an assistant who recorded them neatly on a scroll. "Proportions acceptable," he said, as if she were an object of craftsmanship. Then came the flexibility tests. He lifted her arms, bent her knees, pressed her shoulders down until the joints strained. "Good," he murmured. "Strong ligaments." When she flinched, he looked at her briefly. "Do not move. It disrupts accuracy." There was no malice in his tone, which somehow made it worse. Indifference, Zara realized, was more terrifying than cruelty. Cruelty at least acknowledged your pain. Indifference erased it. When the doctor's hands reached lower, she shut her eyes. The world receded to sound, the soft scrape of metal against wood, the rustle of parchment, the scratching of a quill. Her body ceased to feel like hers. It became a landscape of procedures. At some point, she heard him say, "Internal examination." The phrase meant nothing until it did. The attendants moved closer. One took her wrist. Another whispered, "Breathe." She didn't understand what was happening until she felt the invasion. Sharp, cold, unbearable. She gasped but made no sound. The walls spun. The candle flames blurred. When it was over, he wiped his hands, noted something on the scroll, and said, "Intact." He didn't look at her again. The attendants helped her sit up, but she felt as if she had been hollowed out, emptied of weight, of warmth, of self. She stared at the doctor's notes, the lines of ink that reduced her existence to numbers and descriptions. Healthy, fertile, compliant. As they led her back to her chamber, Zara walked mechanically, her bare feet leaving faint marks on the marble floor. She didn't cry. She couldn't. Something deeper than tears had been taken. The examinations became routine. Every few days, without warning, she was summoned again. Sometimes in the morning, sometimes late at night. The inconsistency was deliberate. The mind cannot prepare for what has no pattern. Each time, Dr. Bahram repeated the same motions. Measure, probe, record. Each time, Zara dissociated a little more. She learned to separate herself from her body entirely, watching from somewhere far away as the procedures unfolded. Occasionally, he asked questions in a tone of distant curiosity. "Have you experienced fainting?" "No, doctor." "Night tremors?" "No, doctor." "Bleeding?" "No, doctor." She answered automatically, though she no longer knew whether the words were true. Her body had stopped communicating with her. It belonged to the empire now, a specimen, a vessel, a document of flesh. What disturbed her most was the physician's precision. He never raised his voice, never smiled or frowned. He treated her with the same clinical focus he might have given a rare plant. He wasn't trying to harm her. He was trying to measure her destruction. Once, she caught sight of the ledger he kept, pages filled with names and notes. Princess Fatima, hysteria subsiding. Princess Ashraf, nervous exhaustion desirable. Princess Zara, steady compliance, mild panic response at intervals. The realization came like a cold wind through her ribs. He wasn't healing anyone. He was documenting the success of the breaking process. Each symptom was progress. Each panic attack was evidence of proper conditioning. After one session, as he recorded his notes, she whispered, "Why are you doing this?" He looked up, startled, as if the question itself were an anomaly. Then, almost gently, he said, "Because the Shah commands it. Because it is necessary." "Necessary for what?" "For peace in the household," he replied. "A calm wife makes a calm court." He said it with such conviction that for a moment, she almost believed him. When she returned to her chamber, she began to experience what modern minds would call dissociation. She would sit for hours staring at her hands, unsure they were hers. Sometimes she pressed her palms together just to feel the pressure, to confirm she still existed. But even that sensation began to fade. Sleep became a battlefield. Her body shook at night from silent panic. She woke gasping, heart racing, drenched in sweat, though she no longer remembered why. When the attendants came to check on her, they smiled approvingly. "She is learning," one whispered. "The doctor says her fear is maturing." Maturing. The word twisted her insides. Fear was being cultivated in her like a crop, tended, measured, harvested. One evening, during yet another examination, Dr. Bahram paused. "You are quieter now," he said. "Good. Your husband will find you suitable." Zara said nothing, but as she stared at the flickering candle behind him, she noticed something strange. The flame moved even when the air was still, as though some unseen force kept disturbing it. It reminded her of herself, constantly trembling, even in stillness. When the doctor left, she reached out toward the flame. It flickered violently, and she pulled her hand back before she was burned. For the first time in weeks, she felt something, pain that was hers alone. Real, raw, unmeasured. And though it lasted only a second, it made her heart beat faster than it had in months. That night, she lay awake and whispered to herself the only truth she still recognized. They can measure everything, but not this. It wasn't defiance exactly, more like a whisper of self-awareness rising through layers of numbness. But in the architecture of oppression, even a whisper could be dangerous. By dawn, she was summoned again. The same corridor, the same cold light, the same voice, lie down. This time, she didn't resist, not outwardly. But when she closed her eyes, she imagined herself elsewhere, walking barefoot through the palace gardens, wind on her face, books in her hands, her body her own. The doctor's voice echoed distantly, "Relax." And she did, but not for him. She relaxed into the dream of freedom, holding it inside where no one could measure, record, or erase it. The final month arrived like winter, quiet, suffocating, and irreversible. Zara's training had ended. The overseers no longer spoke to her except in commands. Her body moved automatically. Her words were reduced to ritual phrases. Even her dreams had been replaced by empty corridors and endless footsteps. The only thing left to take was the illusion of choice. The wedding day began before dawn. The palace hummed with distant music, the hollow echo of celebration. Zara was awakened by her attendants, 3 silent women who entered her room without greeting. They drew the curtains, lit oil lamps, and began to prepare her body. The ritual was slow, almost tender. They bathed her in rose water, combed her hair until it gleamed, and painted her hands with fine crimson henna patterns that crawled up her wrists like delicate chains. Her wedding gown, made of ivory silk embroidered with gold thread, was so heavy she could barely stand. Her veil was pinned with pearls that caught the candlelight like trapped tears. No one spoke her name. No one met her eyes. When they finished, one of the attendants whispered, "It is time." She was led through the marble halls toward the ceremonial chamber. Music swelled from behind the doors. Drums, strings, the sound of joy performed for politics. Inside, nobles and courtiers filled the room, their faces gleaming under lamplight. Zara felt their gazes like heat against her skin. The ceremony itself lasted less than 10 minutes. A mullah recited the vows, his voice calm and distant. A male relative answered in her place. Her proxy, speaking the words of consent she was forbidden to utter herself. When the final prayer ended, she heard the sound of paper tearing slightly as the marriage contract was folded and sealed with wax. It was done. She was now the wife of General Hassan Khan, a man she had spoken to only once, and even then through a veil. The crowd erupted in polite applause. Servants carried trays of sweets. Someone shouted blessings. Zara stood motionless, her face hidden behind lace. Through the veil, she could see him, tall, broad-shouldered, with a trimmed black beard and the distant eyes of a man who had long ago stopped seeing individuals. He looked at her as one might look at a fine horse, assessing value rather than presence. Hours blurred together. She was seated on a cushioned dais, surrounded by food and gifts she could not taste or touch. Musicians played. Guests laughed. Every so often, someone approached to offer congratulations, to admire her beauty, to remark on the fortune of her union. Zara nodded when expected, smiled when ordered, her body performing obedience like a well-rehearsed play. By dusk, the palace lights dimmed. The laughter quieted. The celebration dissolved into whispers. The women came again, their faces expressionless. "It is time," one repeated. Zara followed them down a long corridor that smelled of incense and damp stone. The bridal chamber awaited, the same one she had seen only once, months ago, during the preparation rituals. The door opened with a low creak. Candlelight spilled out, soft and golden. The walls were draped in red silk. The bed was covered in white linen so fine it shimmered. Every object was deliberate, beauty curated to conceal terror. Her attendants undressed her slowly, layer by layer, until she stood in a thin silk gown. The air felt colder than before. They brushed her hair one final time, loosened it down her back, and whispered blessings that sounded like apologies. Then came the final touch, a vial of oil, dabbed behind her ears, her wrists, her neck. The scent was intoxicating, amber and rose. It clung to her like the memory of a dream she didn't want. When they finished, the oldest attendant, Miriam, the overseer of brides, met Zara's eyes for the first time. "Remember what you were taught," she said quietly. "You will not resist. You will not cry. You will make no sound unless he speaks to you." Her voice trembled slightly on the last sentence. She turned and left. The door closed. The lock clicked from the outside. Zara was alone. For the first time that day, silence fell, deep, endless, unbearable. The candles flickered as if uncertain whether to burn or die. She sat on the bed, her hands clasped in her lap, waiting. Every sound became amplified. Her heartbeat, the rustle of silk, the wind against the window lattice. Then, footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Approaching. The door opened. General Hassan Khan entered, his robe dark, his expression unreadable. He smelled faintly of wine and musk. His eyes did not meet hers immediately. He was already undressing as he crossed the room. She wanted to disappear, to dissolve into the candlelight, into the air, into the fabric beneath her fingers. But her body stayed frozen. The training had worked too well. Even terror obeyed. He spoke only once. Do not move. She didn't. The rest happened in silence, the kind of silence that crushes sound before it reaches the air. She felt everything and nothing at once, her mind splintering into fragments that drifted above her, watching from somewhere far away. When it ended, he rose, adjusted his robe, and left the chamber without a word. The door shut. The candles flickered. For a moment, Zara lay still, too numb to breathe. Then, without warning, something inside her snapped. Not a physical sound, but an internal rupture, like glass fracturing in the dark. She screamed. It wasn't a human sound. It was the scream of everything that had been taken, her voice, her body, her mind, her will, all erupting at once. It echoed through the palace halls, through the women's quarters, through the marble and mirrors and silence that had hidden centuries of similar cries. The guards heard it. The servants heard it. Everyone knew what it meant. By dawn, physicians were summoned. They gave her a sedative, opium, most likely, and when she woke, she couldn't tell if it was still night or another day. Her body was heavy, her thoughts thick with fog. The days that followed were quiet. She moved like a shadow through her new life, speaking only when spoken to, smiling when required. The palace praised her composure. A perfect bride, they said. A calm wife. No one mentioned the scream. But the walls remembered. Sometimes, late at night, Zara would wake to the faint echo of it, not from her throat, but from the stones themselves, as if the palace were whispering back the memory of every woman who had ever broken inside it. She would lie still, staring at the ceiling, her mind suspended between numbness and awareness. And in that suspended silence, she would think. They wanted silence. And now they have it. Morning came with silence. Heavy, deliberate, the kind of silence that feels placed, not born. The sun crept through the lattice windows of the Galastan palace, filtering through layers of silk and dust. Light touched the white linen of the bridal bed like the aftermath of snowfall, calm, deceptive, almost holy. But nothing about what had happened was holy. When Zara opened her eyes, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling above her glowed gold in the morning light. The air smelled of rose and smoke. Her body felt both heavy and distant, like she was still buried somewhere beneath her own skin. She tried to move her hand, but it trembled as if disconnected from her will. The door opened. Miriam, the old overseer, entered quietly, her steps careful on the marble. Behind her, two servants carried trays, one with tea, the other with a silver basin of water. They did not look at Zara. They moved with the precision of people performing a sacred duty they did not believe in. Miriam approached the bed. She said nothing at first. Then she lifted a corner of the sheet, checking it for a single sign, the stain that proved the ritual had been completed. Her face did not change. She nodded to the servants, who took the sheets away. "It is done," she said softly, as if pronouncing a verdict. Zara wanted to ask what that meant, but her throat refused. Words belonged to another world, a world that had been taken from her in the dark hours of the night. They dressed her in a new gown, soft silk, pale blue, embroidered with pearls. The color of serenity, they said, the color of a dutiful wife. Her hair was braided and perfumed. When she looked into the mirror, she saw a reflection that felt foreign, beautiful, composed, lifeless. The girl who had once existed beneath that face was gone, replaced by something that moved, smiled, and obeyed on command. Later that morning, she was escorted to the breakfast chamber where her husband waited. Hassan Khan sat by the window, eating pomegranates from a silver bowl. His demeanor was calm, detached, the face of a man for whom last night had been nothing more than an obligation. When Zara entered, he looked at her once, briefly, coldly, and gestured for her to sit. "You will remain in the women's quarters unless summoned," he said without greeting. "You will speak only when addressed. You will bear children, and you will honor this house." She nodded automatically. "Do you understand?" "Yes," she whispered. He returned to his meal. "Good. Then we will have peace." Peace. The word struck her like a blade, as though silence and subjugation could ever mean peace. After that day, time lost its shape. Zara lived in the rhythm of duty, morning rituals, evening prayers, scheduled visits from tutors, carefully timed audiences with her husband. Each movement was measured, each phrase rehearsed. She walked through the palace like a specter, never leaving footprints, never disturbing the air. Her attendants treated her with a reverence that bordered on fear. They avoided eye contact, speaking only in murmurs. To them, she was both sacred and cursed, the embodiment of the empire's perfection and its cruelty. But inside, Zara felt nothing sacred, only emptiness. Nights were the worst. When the candles dimmed and the corridors fell quiet, her mind began to replay the fragments she had tried to bury, the sound of footsteps, the weight of silence, the way her scream had echoed back from the marble walls and been swallowed whole. She would wake gasping, drenched in sweat, unable to tell whether she had been dreaming or remembering. Sometimes she thought she heard other screams, faint, distant, buried beneath the palace hum. She told herself they were echoes from her own mind, but part of her knew better. She wasn't the first. She wouldn't be the last. Weeks passed, then months. When she missed her bleeding for the second time, the physician was summoned. He examined her in silence, his hands cold as marble, his voice distant as ever. "She is with child," he said simply. The news was celebrated with quiet ceremony. Servants brought sweets. The overseers blessed her. Hassan Khan smiled for the first time, a brief curve of the lips that carried no warmth. "You have done well," he said. "Now your purpose begins." Purpose. That word almost made her laugh. But her body didn't remember how. Pregnancy brought its own confinement. She was guarded more closely, watched even as she slept. The physician visited weekly, recording her pulse, her temperature, her silence. He praised her composure, unaware that it wasn't serenity but detachment, a numbness so complete it looked like grace. She gave birth in winter. The labor was long, the pain unrelenting. For hours she drifted between consciousness and oblivion, her screams muffled by thick walls. When it was over, they placed a child in her arms, a boy, small and fragile, his skin soft as silk. For a moment, she felt something, a flicker of life, a spark of something that almost resembled love. But when the nurse reached to take him away, instinct made her tighten her grip. "Please," she whispered, the word unfamiliar on her tongue. "Let me hold him." The nurse hesitated, startled by the request. Then, after a moment, she nodded. Zara held her son close, feeling his heartbeat against hers. It was faint but real, the first real thing she had touched in months. For the first time since the night she screamed, she cried. No one saw, no one heard. The tears slipped silently down her face, falling onto the baby's blanket, vanishing like rain on marble. When her husband came to see the child, he looked pleased. "He will have my name," he said. Then he left. That night, Zara whispered to her son, though she knew he couldn't understand. "You will not be like them," she said softly. "You will not learn their silence." But even as she said it, a part of her feared the truth, that the silence she carried might already be passing into him, like a curse written in blood. Years later, people in the palace would remember her as serene, gentle, obedient, the perfect wife of Hassan Khan. They would say she brought stability to his household, that she never raised her voice, never defied her duties. What they wouldn't say, because they didn't see, or refused to, was that she had stopped existing long before her death. When she finally fell ill in her early 50s, the physicians wrote, "wasting disease," on the report. But the servants whispered something else, that she had simply decided to stop breathing. That one day she lay down and never rose again. The empire recorded her as a success, a loyal wife, a devoted mother, a name in the lineage of noble women who ensured dynastic continuity. But the palace itself remembered differently. Those who lived there years later claimed that on certain winter nights, when the corridors were empty and the wind blew through the lattice windows, they could hear a faint sound, not quite human, not quite wind, echoing from the women's quarters. A sound like the beginning of a scream that never finished. Some said it was the ghost of a princess. Others said it was the memory of obedience itself, refusing to die. And maybe both were true.